I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever watched water rise, inch by inch, and realized there was absolutely nothing you could do to stop it? Have you ever stood inside your own home, the place where your children sleep, where your grandmother's photographs hang on the wall, where the smell of Sunday morning coffee still lingers in the curtains, and watched that home fill with dark, filthy water? Have you ever climbed into your own attic in the middle of the night, not to store old boxes, but to survive? Have you ever pressed your face against your own ceiling, gasping for air, while everything you ever owned disappeared beneath you? If you have, then you already know a piece of what the people in this story went through. And if you haven't, then tonight, you're going to understand what it feels like. On August 29, 2005, a hurricane named Katrina made landfall on the Gulf Coast of the United States. But it was not the wind that killed, it was the water. It was the failure of walls that were supposed to hold. It was the collapse of promises that were supposed to protect. And it was the abandonment of people who were supposed to matter. More than 1,300 people died. 80% of one of America's greatest cities was swallowed by floodwater. And the richest nation on earth watched it happen on live television and could not figure out how to help. This is the story of Hurricane Katrina, and it changed America forever. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was there. New Orleans, Louisiana. A city unlike any other in America. Built in a crescent along the Mississippi River, it sat like a bowl between the great river to the south and the vast expanse of Lake Pontchartrain to the north. Much of it rested below sea level, a fact that locals joked about, but that engineers quietly worried over for more than a century. In 2005, roughly 455,000 people called New Orleans home. It was a city of music and food, of jazz funerals and second-line parades, of gumbo simmering on stoves and brass bands echoing through the French Quarter on any given Tuesday night. It was a city that had perfected the art of celebration. Mardi Gras was not just a holiday, it was an identity. The city didn't just play music, it invented it. Louis Armstrong was born in these streets. The blues came through here on its way to shaping American culture. But beneath the celebration lived a different reality. New Orleans was also a city of deep poverty and profound inequality. Nearly 28% of its residents lived below the poverty line, more than double the national average. The poverty was not evenly distributed. In neighborhoods like the lower Ninth Ward, the poverty rate was even higher. These were predominantly black communities, home to families who had lived on the same streets for generations. Many were homeowners, many were elderly, and many did not own cars. That last fact would become a death sentence. The geography of New Orleans made it uniquely vulnerable. The city sat in what engineers called a bowl, surrounded on all sides by water held back by a system of levees, flood walls, and pump stations. Lake Pontchartrain to the north, the Mississippi River curving along the south, swampland and bayou stretching to the east and west. When rain fell in New Orleans, it could not drain naturally. It had to be pumped out. The entire existence of the city depended on a complex system of drainage and protection that had been built over more than 200 years. The levee system was managed by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. After Hurricane Betsy devastated the city in 1965, Congress authorized the Lake Pontchartrain and Vicinity Hurricane Protection Project. The plan was to build a system of levees and flood walls strong enough to protect against a fast-moving Category 3 hurricane. The project was initially estimated to take 13 years. By 2005, 40 years later, it was still not finished. The levees that did exist were, in the words of investigators who would later examine them, a system in name only. They were not planned, designed, or constructed as integrated elements. Different sections were built at different times, by different agencies, to different standards. Some sections sat on soil so soft it was described as jelly-like clay. Others had been patched and repaired so many times that no one was entirely sure what was holding them together. Scientists and journalists had been warning for years that a major hurricane could be catastrophic for New Orleans. In 2001, The Houston Chronicle published a series predicting that a storm surge could overtop the levees and flood the city. In 2002, the New Orleans Times-Picayune ran a 5-part series titled Washing Away, which described in chilling detail exactly how a major hurricane would destroy the city. The series predicted mass casualties, a flooded Superdome, and a humanitarian crisis. Every prediction would come true. In the summer of 2004, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, conducted a disaster simulation called Hurricane Pam. The exercise modeled a slow-moving Category 3 hurricane making a direct hit on New Orleans. The simulation predicted catastrophic flooding, more than 60,000 casualties, and the displacement of over 1 million people. It predicted that the levees would fail. It predicted that hundreds of thousands of residents would be unable to evacuate because they lacked transportation. The simulation was so alarming that officials planned follow-up exercises to address the gaps it revealed. But FEMA could not find $15,000 to cover travel expenses for the follow-up workshop. It was delayed. Then Katrina came. The warnings had been there. The science had been clear. The predictions had been published, and still nothing had been done. New Orleans was a city that lived on borrowed time, and everyone who studied it knew it. The land itself was sinking. Geologists call it subsidence, the slow, relentless settling of soft delta soil. Every year, parts of the city dropped a little lower. The marshlands and barrier islands that once stood between New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico, natural buffers that absorbed storm surge energy before it reached the city, were disappearing at a rate of approximately 25 square miles per year. Canals built for oil and gas exploration had cut the wetlands apart. The Mississippi River, confined by levees for flood control, could no longer deposit the sediment that had built and sustained the delta for thousands of years. The very infrastructure that kept the river from flooding the city was causing the land around the city to vanish. By 2005, the buffer was thin. The ocean was closer than it had been in a century, and the bowl that was New Orleans sat lower than it ever had before. Walk the streets of New Orleans before Katrina, and you would find a city of astonishing beauty and deep contradiction. In the Garden District, oak-lined avenues canopied with Spanish moss led to antebellum mansions worth millions. A few miles east, in the 7th Ward and the 9th Ward, shotgun houses sat on streets without sidewalks, their porches populated by families who could trace their roots in the neighborhood back 4 and 5 generations. The median household income in some of the wealthiest census tracts was more than 10 times the median in the poorest. The city's economy ran on tourism and the port. The Port of New Orleans was one of the busiest in the nation, handling more than 80 million tons of cargo per year. The tourist industry brought millions of visitors to the French Quarter, the Garden District, and the countless music venues and restaurants that defined the city's global reputation. But beyond the tourist corridors, the economy was fragile. Good jobs were scarce. The public school system was widely considered one of the worst in America. Infrastructure was crumbling. Storm drains were clogged. Streets were potholed. The pumping stations that kept the city dry were aging and underfunded. It was, in every sense, a city waiting for a reckoning. On August 23, 2005, a tropical depression formed over the southeastern Bahamas, approximately 350 miles east of Miami. Within 24 hours, it had strengthened into Tropical Storm Katrina. Forecasters at the National Hurricane Center began tracking it carefully. By Thursday, August 25th, Katrina had become a Category 1 hurricane as it crossed the southern tip of Florida. It killed 6 people there and knocked out power to more than 1 million homes. But Florida was only the beginning. As Katrina moved into the Gulf of Mexico on Friday, August 26th, something ominous happened. The storm crossed the Loop Current, an area of unusually warm, deep water. The warm water acted like rocket fuel. Katrina began to intensify rapidly. By that evening, it had become a Category 2 hurricane. The National Hurricane Center issued an urgent advisory. Director Max Mayfield did something he rarely did. He personally called the governors of Mississippi and Louisiana and the mayor of New Orleans to warn them about what was coming. "This is really scary," Mayfield told reporters. "This is a worst-case scenario." On Saturday, August 27th, Katrina exploded into a Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds of 115 miles per hour. Forecasters warned it could reach Category 4 or 5 before making landfall. The governors of Louisiana and Mississippi declared states of emergency. Contraflow traffic plans were activated on Louisiana's highways, allowing all lanes to flow outbound from New Orleans. But Mayor Ray Nagin hesitated. He issued a voluntary evacuation order on Saturday evening, but not a mandatory one. He later said he feared that a mandatory evacuation would lead to lawsuits from business owners. The Hurricane Pam exercise had estimated that a full evacuation of New Orleans would require 72 hours. By Saturday evening, there were fewer than 36 hours left. On Sunday morning, August 28th, Nagin finally issued the first mandatory evacuation in New Orleans history. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. Katrina was now expected to make landfall in less than 24 hours. For many residents, it was already too late. The problem was not just timing. The problem was transportation. An estimated 100,000 residents of New Orleans did not own cars. Many were elderly, many were disabled, many were poor. The city's emergency plan called for using city buses and school buses to transport people who could not evacuate on their own. But the plan was never fully implemented. The Louisiana National Guard requested 700 buses from FEMA. They received 100. As the highways filled with cars heading north and west, those who could not leave gathered at the last resort, the Louisiana Superdome. Mayor Nagin had designated it as a shelter, telling evacuees to bring enough food and water for 3 to 4 days. By Sunday evening, approximately 10,000 people had crowded into the stadium. By the time Katrina arrived, that number would grow to more than 25,000. Throughout Sunday, Katrina continued to grow. At 5 o'clock that morning, it had been upgraded to a Category 5 hurricane, the most powerful classification. With sustained winds of 175 miles per hour and a central pressure of 902 millibars. It was one of the most powerful Atlantic hurricanes ever recorded. The National Weather Service office in New Orleans issued a bulletin that afternoon that read like a prophecy of doom. It warned of devastating damage and predicted that most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer. It predicted that water would rise to 15 to 20 feet above normal tide levels. It warned that the majority of industrial buildings will become non-functional and that all wood-framed, low-rising apartment buildings will be destroyed. That Sunday night, as darkness fell over the Gulf Coast, hundreds of thousands of people who had evacuated sat in hotel rooms and relatives' homes, watching the Weather Channel and praying. And approximately 100,000 people who had not left, who could not leave, tried to sleep through the howling wind, knowing that morning would bring something terrible. The last normal night in New Orleans was August 28, 2005. Nothing would ever be the same. At the Superdome, the scene that Sunday night was already grim. Thousands of people were spread across the stadium's seats, concourses, and field level, clutching plastic bags and small suitcases containing whatever they had been able to grab before leaving home. National Guard soldiers patrolled the facility, but their numbers were insufficient for the growing crowd. The air conditioning was still functioning, but the sheer number of bodies was already making the air thick and uncomfortable. Many evacuees had brought elderly relatives in wheelchairs. Some carried infants. A few had pets, despite the rule against them, because they could not bear to leave them behind. Outside, the wind was picking up. Palm trees along Poydras Street bent like fishing rods. Debris began to fly. The streets were emptying as the last holdouts retreated indoors. On some blocks, a single light burned in a single window. A resident who had decided to stay, who had boarded up the windows and stocked the pantry and believed they could ride it out the way they always had. In the hospitals across the city, administrators were making final preparations. Generators were tested. Emergency supplies were inventoried. Staff were assigned to overnight shifts that many sensed might last far longer than a single night. At Memorial Medical Center on Napoleon Avenue, patients in intensive care units were connected to ventilators powered by a grid that would not survive the morning. On the Mississippi Gulf Coast, in communities like Biloxi, Gulfport, and Pass Christian, residents braced for a direct hit. These towns sat at sea level along the beach, with nothing between them and the Gulf of Mexico. Some residents had survived Hurricane Camille in 1969, which had devastated the same coastline. They knew what a storm surge could do. Many evacuated. Some stayed, believing their homes could endure what Camille had thrown at them. They were wrong. Katrina's surge along the Mississippi coast would reach heights that dwarfed anything Camille had produced. In some locations, the wall of water would rise to 28 feet above normal sea level, obliterating everything in its path for blocks inland. But it was New Orleans that the world would remember, because what happened there was not simply a natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe, built on decades of neglect, wrapped inside a hurricane. Monday, August 29th, 6:10 in the morning. Hurricane Katrina makes its first Gulf Coast landfall near Buras, Louisiana, a small community in Plaquemines Parish, about 65 miles southeast of New Orleans. The storm has weakened slightly from its Category 5 peak, but it is still an enormous and devastating Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds near 127 miles per hour. Its storm surge is staggering. Along the Mississippi coastline, walls of water rise 25 to 28 feet above normal sea level, but the damage has already begun before the eye reaches land. At 5 o'clock that morning, more than an hour before official landfall, the Army Corps of Engineers receives its first report. The levees along the 17th Street Canal, the largest drainage canal in the city, have been breached. Water from Lake Pontchartrain is pouring into the Lakeview neighborhood. Homes are flooding to their rooflines within minutes. At the same time, to the east of the city, massive storm surges are racing up the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, a 76-mile navigation channel that acts like a funnel, concentrating the surge and directing it straight towards St. Bernard Parish and the lower 9th Ward. The water hits the Industrial Canal levee like a battering ram. The flood wall does not hold. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, a section of the Industrial Canal flood wall collapses. 25 feet of water explodes into the lower 9th Ward. Robert Green is inside his family's home on Tennessee Street. He is with his 3 grandchildren, ages 2, 3, and 4. His 73-year-old mother Joyce is there. His brother, his cousin, 7 family members, in a house that is about to be ripped from its foundation. We had 5 minutes to get from inside the house into the attic, Green would later recall. 5 minutes to get onto the roof, and now we're floating up the street. The house lifts off its foundation. With the family clinging to the roof, it floats down the flooded street like a raft, crashing into other homes, hitting trees, spinning in the current. Green puts his 3-year-old granddaughter Shania on the roof. He turns his back for a moment to reach for the other children. Shania falls off the roof into the dark water. She is gone. Green's mother, Joyce, the matriarch of the family, the woman who raised him in the lower 9th Ward. She cannot survive the water in her lungs. By the time the house finally comes to rest against a massive oak tree, Joyce Green is dead. I cried so hard the first time I told the story, Green would say, years later, and the second time, and the 50th time. Across the city, the nightmare is unfolding simultaneously in dozens of neighborhoods. The 17th Street Canal breach is widening. The London Avenue Canal fails in 2 places. The Industrial Canal is breached on both the east and west sides. In total, more than 50 failures in the levee system send water cascading into neighborhoods that have never flooded before. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the National Weather Service issues a flash flood warning, noting that the Industrial Canal levee has been breached and 3 to 8 feet of water is expected. But by then, much of the lower 9th Ward is already under 20 feet of water. The warning comes too late for the people who are already drowning. Inside the Superdome, conditions are deteriorating. The wind tears sections of the roof away. Rain pours through the holes. The power goes out. leaving only dim emergency lighting from backup generators. The air conditioning fails. In the August heat, temperatures inside the stadium climb past 100 degrees. The toilets overflow. The smell becomes unbearable. More than 25,000 people are packed inside. Many are elderly. Many are children. Many are sick. There are people in wheelchairs, people on oxygen, people who need medications they did not bring enough of. Louisiana National Guard soldiers work to protect the emergency generators from rising floodwater outside the building, and still the water rises. By midday on Monday, 80% of New Orleans is underwater. In some neighborhoods, the water is 15 feet deep. In the lower Ninth Ward, it reaches the rooflines of two-story homes. People who retreated to their attics find themselves trapped. Some chop through their roofs with axes and hatchets to escape onto the rooftops. Others, the elderly, the disabled, those who cannot swim, do not make it out. The sounds are the sounds of a city dying. The roar of wind, the crash of debris, the groan of buildings shifting on their foundations, and beneath all of it, a sound that survivors describe as the most terrifying of all, the sound of water. Not rushing water, not crashing waves, just the slow, relentless sound of water rising, inch by inch. Unstoppable. When the wind finally begins to die down on Monday afternoon, a strange and terrible silence settles over the city. And then, a new sound begins. The sound of people calling for help, from rooftops, from attic windows, from the second floors of flooded homes. Thousands of voices, scattered across miles of floodwater, crying out into the humid air. At the convention center, a massive facility along the riverfront, thousands more people gather. Unlike the Superdome, the convention center was never designated as an official shelter. There are no supplies, no food, no water, no medical staff, no security. People simply walk there because it is the largest dry building they can find. Over the next several days, more than 19,000 people will crowd into the convention center. Many will wait for help that does not come. The Coast Guard launches rescue operations almost immediately. Even while tropical storm force winds are still blowing across the city, 7 helicopters take off and begin pulling people from rooftops. Over the next 10 days, the Coast Guard will rescue more than 33,500 people, including 6,500 by helicopter. It is the largest air rescue operation in Coast Guard history. At peak operations, Coast Guard crews are rescuing 750 people per hour by boat and 100 per hour by air. Petty Officer Sean Beatty, a rescue swimmer from Clearwater, Florida, is lowered from a helicopter into the flooded streets of New Orleans on August 30th. He will spend the next several days swimming through contaminated water, breaking into attics, and carrying survivors to safety. He and his crew rescue hundreds, but the Coast Guard cannot reach everyone. The city is vast. The flooding is everywhere. Communications have collapsed. Cell towers are down. Phone lines are dead. Police radios are failing. Emergency dispatchers cannot reach first responders. First responders cannot reach each other. The coordination that emergency management depends on simply does not exist. Monday night arrives. The city is dark. No street lights, no house lights, no traffic signals, just darkness and water and the distant sound of helicopters. And the people of New Orleans wait. They wait on rooftops. They wait in attics. They wait in the Superdome. They wait at the convention center. They wait on highway overpasses, standing in the sun with no shade, no water, no food, no information. On the Interstate 10 overpass near the Causeway Boulevard interchange, hundreds of people gather on the elevated concrete above the floodwater. Some have waded for miles through chest-deep water to reach this strip of dry pavement. There is no shade. The August sun beats down at temperatures exceeding 90 degrees. Children cry from thirst. Elderly people lie on the concrete, too exhausted to stand. A few families have managed to bring coolers with water and share them until they are empty. No buses come, no trucks come, no government officials come. For 2 days, 3 days, these people wait on the overpass, some fashion signs from cardboard, and hold them toward the occasional helicopter that passes overhead. Help us. We need water. Baby needs medicine. In the 9th ward, a woman named Torrenzette Andrews holds her children close as water fills the room around them. She does not know if anyone is coming to evacuate them. She does not know what their next step will be. All she knows is that the water is rising and she cannot stop it. Andrews and her family will eventually be rescued, but the psychological trauma will follow them for years. It will be more than a decade before she returns to New Orleans. In the waters themselves, the scene is surreal and horrifying. Refrigerators float alongside children's toys. Cars are submerged with only their rooftops visible. Snakes swim through living rooms. Fire ants form floating islands on the surface of the water, a writhing mass of insects seeking dry ground. The smell is overwhelming, a combination of raw sewage, gasoline, rotting food, and something else that survivors describe simply as death. At night, the darkness is absolute. There are no lights anywhere, no street lamps, no windows glowing, no headlights moving on streets that are now rivers. Only the distant thrum of helicopter blades and the occasional crack of a gunshot somewhere in the city. And always, always, the sound of people shouting into the darkness, calling out to anyone who might hear. They wait for help that is agonizingly slow to arrive. Tuesday, August 30th. The first full day after landfall. The sun rises over a city that no longer exists in any recognizable form. Aerial photographs show an urban landscape that looks more like a lake than a city. Only the tops of buildings and trees are visible above the brown, toxic water. Cars are submerged. Highway overpasses cut through the floodwater like bridges over a vast, muddy sea. Here and there, a rooftop is visible with tiny figures standing on it, waving sheets and shirts, desperate to be seen. The floodwater is not just water. It is a toxic soup of sewage, industrial chemicals, gasoline, oil, and decomposing debris. It smells of rot and fuel. It burns the skin. It carries bacteria that will cause infections in anyone exposed to it for too long, and it is everywhere. Governor Kathleen Blanco visits the Superdome on Tuesday and is horrified by what she sees. She concludes immediately that the stadium must be evacuated, but FEMA is unable to provide buses. The agency's logistics have collapsed. Buses that were supposed to be staged nearby have not arrived. Requests for transportation go unanswered for hours, then days. Meanwhile, at the convention center, the situation is descending into chaos. There is no organized government presence. There are no supplies. People are dying. Elderly residents succumb to heat exhaustion and dehydration. Parents beg for water for their children. Bodies are placed in corners and covered with sheets because there is nowhere else to put them. On Wednesday, August 31st, FEMA Director Michael Brown tells reporters that the federal response is going well. "I think things are going relatively well," he says from Baton Rouge. He does not visit the Superdome. He does not visit the convention center. In fact, government reports would later reveal that Brown was completely unaware that thousands of people were stranded at the convention center until NBC anchor Brian Williams asked him about it during a live television interview on Thursday, 3 days after the storm. "We just learned about the convention center," Brown admitted on national television. 3 days, 19,000 people, no food, no water, no help. And the head of FEMA did not know they were there. Terry Ebert, the head of New Orleans Emergency Operations, watches the federal response with growing fury. "This is a national disgrace," he tells the Associated Press. "FEMA has been here 3 days, yet there is no command and control. We can send massive amounts of aid to tsunami victims, but we can't bail out the city of New Orleans. The death toll mounts. 40% of all fatalities in Louisiana are from drowning. More than half of all victims are senior citizens, people over the age of 61. Many die in their homes, unable to escape the rising water. Many die in attics where they retreated as the floodwater climbed. Some die in nursing homes and hospitals where staff are overwhelmed and evacuation plans fail. At Memorial Medical Center, Doctors and nurses are stranded with critically ill patients as the hospital floods and the power fails. Temperatures inside the hospital climb past 100 degrees. Backup generators begin to fail. For 5 days, the medical staff work without electricity, without running water, without adequate supplies, trying to keep their patients alive. Decisions are made in those dark hallways that will haunt the medical profession for years. By Thursday, September 1st, the rest of America is watching New Orleans die on live television. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Every network broadcasts the same images. People on rooftops. People wading through chest-deep water. People screaming for help from the Superdome. The contrast between what Americans are seeing on their screens and what government officials are saying in press conferences creates a cognitive dissonance that infuriates the nation. On Friday, September 2nd, President George W. Bush arrives in the region for an aerial tour. He does not land in New Orleans. His now infamous words to FEMA Director Brown, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job," become a symbol of a government disconnected from reality. That same day, Lieutenant General Russell Honore arrives with 30,000 National Guard and regular Army troops. With Blanco's consent, Bush has ordered a massive military deployment. Honore immediately begins organizing evacuations, establishing order, and delivering supplies. His gruff, no-nonsense style earns him the nickname, the Ragin' Cajun, and the gratitude of desperate survivors. Within days, the Superdome and Convention Center are finally emptied. Evacuees are bused to the Houston Astrodome and to shelters across the country. But by then, thousands have already suffered for nearly a week without adequate food, water, or medical care. And the dead are still being counted. The final accounting of lives lost would take months. The original estimates placed the death toll at more than 1,800. A later NOAA analysis, incorporating additional medical records, would revise the figure to 1,392 total fatalities, including 520 direct deaths and 565 indirect deaths, with the majority of indirect fatalities caused by cardiovascular events triggered by the extreme stress. An additional 307 deaths could not be definitively classified. 652 people were reported missing and never found. Whatever the precise number, the human cost was staggering, and much of it was preventable. The media coverage of Katrina became a story in itself. For perhaps the first time in decades, American television journalists abandoned the pretense of detached objectivity and expressed raw emotion on camera. CNN's Anderson Cooper confronted Louisiana Senator Mary Landrieu on live television, cutting her off mid-sentence as she praised government officials. "Do you get the anger that is out here?" he demanded. NBC's Brian Williams reported from the convention center, describing scenes that he said would haunt him for the rest of his career. The images broadcast from New Orleans shocked the world. America, the richest country on earth, was watching its own citizens die on live television. The contrast between the suffering on the ground and the reassurances from Washington created a credibility gap that would define the remainder of the Bush presidency. Around the world, governments offered aid. Cuba offered to send doctors. Venezuela offered fuel. Germany, France, and dozens of other nations pledged support. The spectacle of America needing international disaster relief was itself a kind of national trauma. The racial dimension of the crisis was impossible to ignore. The overwhelming majority of those trapped at the Superdome and the Convention Center were black. The majority of those who died were black. The neighborhoods that flooded most severely were predominantly black. The people who lacked transportation to evacuate were disproportionately black. The activist Malik Rahim put it bluntly. "We got hit by 3 hurricanes," he said. "Everybody knows the first one, Katrina. But then we got hit by hurricane corruption and hurricane racism. Whether the response would have been faster if the victims had been white was a question that many asked and few answered satisfactorily. What was clear was that poverty and race had determined, in large measure, who was able to evacuate and who was not, who had flood insurance and who did not, who could afford to rebuild and who could not. Katrina did not create these inequalities. It exposed them in a way that could not be denied or explained away. The statistics of Katrina are overwhelming, but statistics are abstractions. Behind every number is a name. Behind every name is a story. Here are 4 of them. Robert Greene Sr. grew up in the lower 9th Ward. He loved the neighborhood. He described it as landlocked, so tightly knit, so deeply rooted that there was no room for strangers. Families had lived there for generations. People knew their neighbors. Children played in the same streets where their grandparents had played. Greene had survived hurricanes before. Betsy in '65, Camille in '69. He expected Katrina would bring some fallen trees, some damaged roofing, maybe a few days without power. He never expected 25 feet of water. When the Industrial Canal floodwall collapsed, the water came so fast that Greene and his family had only minutes. They scrambled from the first floor to the attic, from the attic to the roof, and then the house lifted off its foundation and floated. Greene placed his 3-year-old granddaughter Shania on the roof. He turned to grab the other children. In that instant, Shania fell off the roof into the black water. She was gone. His mother, Joyce, 73 years old, could not survive the water that filled her lungs as the house was tossed through the flood. By the time the house came to rest against an old oak tree, Joyce was dead. 4 months later, Greene and other family members found her remains in the wreckage of the house. After Katrina, Greene lived in a FEMA trailer next to the ruins of his home for nearly 4 years. He put up 2 memorial markers for his mother and granddaughter, and a sign that read, "Roots run deep here." Eventually, the Make It Right Foundation built him a new home on the same lot. Every year on August 29th, Greene leads what he calls the Roof Riders March. Walking from the spot on Tennessee Street where his house came off its foundation to the oak tree where it came to rest. They wear matching shirts. They read aloud the names of the dead. A second-line brass band plays, because in New Orleans, even grief gets a soundtrack. "I'm a New Orleanian," Greene says. He never left for good. Lakita Williams was pregnant during Katrina. She was with her partner, Travis Randolph, and their 9-month-old baby. They had decided to ride out the storm, believing the warnings were exaggerated. For 2 days, Williams and her family were trapped in the sweltering attic of her parents' home in New Orleans. The heat was unbearable. The baby was crying. When the water finally receded enough to leave the house, it was still waist-deep. They spent a 3rd night outside on a mattress they found floating nearby. And then a man appeared in a canoe, a stranger. Williams had never seen him before. He paddled through the flooded streets, picking up survivors, ferrying them to higher ground. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't want anything. He just helped. I had never seen the man in the canoe before, but I can still see his face, Williams said 20 years later. He basically saved our lives. We could see helicopters hovering, but no one ever came. But this man did. It's like he was sent for us. She never learned his name. She never saw him again. But she remembers his face, and she remembers the simple truth he demonstrated, that in the worst moments, ordinary people often do what governments cannot. John Keller was a former Marine reconnaissance specialist living in an apartment building in New Orleans known as the American Can, a converted factory building near the Mid-City neighborhood. When Katrina hit, nearly 300 residents were trapped inside. The building was surrounded by floodwater. No rescue was coming. Keller waited. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. By the 5th day, it was clear that no one was coming for them. Food was running low. Water was scarce. Looters were approaching the building. Once a Marine, always a Marine. Keller took charge. He organized the residents. He secured the building against looters. Then he did something extraordinary. He swam through the contaminated floodwater, found abandoned boats, and hot-wired them. Using these stolen and repurposed boats, Keller began ferrying the residents of the American Can to a strip of dry land where helicopters could reach them. Trip after trip, through water filled with sewage and chemicals and debris, he stayed until every single one of the 240 people in that building had been evacuated. A neighbor who watched the rescue effort summed it up simply. That's my definition of a hero. David Brittle had just moved to New Orleans with his family. His father, Major Brittle, served as the area commander of the Salvation Army in the city. When Katrina hit, David set out to find his parents. What followed was a 2.5-day odyssey through the flooded streets of New Orleans. Riding in an airboat along Highway 10, Brittle pushed past police warnings. He passed the Garden District and the French Quarter, landmarks that were unrecognizable under water and debris. "I've never seen or felt darkness like that before," he said. You could hear gunshots, helicopters overhead, and people screaming in the distance. Along the way, Brittle rescued others, strangers, people trapped on rooftops and in flooded homes. He had gone looking for his family and found himself unable to pass by anyone who needed help. He tried repeatedly to reach first responders using a payphone. Nothing but silence on the other end. And then, on his last attempt, someone answered. Help was coordinated. More people were saved. Brittle lost a parent in the storm, but he saved others. And he would later dedicate his life to disaster relief through the Salvation Army, driven by the memory of those dark waters and the screaming he could not stop hearing. These are 4 stories. There are thousands more. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be heard. Hurricane Katrina did not have to be a catastrophe of this magnitude. The storm was powerful, yes, but the death toll and the suffering were not inevitable. They were the result of decades of failure. Failure to prepare, failure to protect, failure to respond, and failure to care. The levee system that was supposed to protect New Orleans was designed and built by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. 7 major investigations conducted after Katrina all reached the same conclusion. The primary cause of the catastrophic flooding was inadequate design and construction by the Corps. More than 50 failures were documented in the levee system. Some sections were overtopped by the massive storm surge, but others, including critical failures along the 17th Street Canal, the London Avenue Canal, and the Industrial Canal, collapsed at water levels well below what they were designed to withstand. The 17th Street Canal floodwall failed because it was built on a foundation of weak, compressible soil. As the storm surge pushed against the wall, the water pressure shoved the wall outward, cutting the levee in half. The inflowing water rapidly widened the breach. This was not a case of a storm exceeding the design capacity. This was a wall that was never strong enough to do what it was supposed to do. The levee system had been authorized by Congress in 1965. It was supposed to take 13 years. 40 years later, it was still not finished. Funding had been delayed repeatedly. Design standards were outdated. Construction quality was inconsistent. And no one, not the Corps, not the state, not the city, was treating the completion of the system as urgent. In June of 2006, the Army Corps of Engineers issued a report of more than 6,000 pages in which it acknowledged that the levees failed due to flawed and outdated engineering practices. It was a rare admission of responsibility from a federal agency, but it came 9 months too late for the people who drowned. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's response to Katrina has been called the greatest failure of emergency management in American history. The failures were systemic and cascading. FEMA turned away trucks from Walmart loaded with water intended for New Orleans survivors. FEMA refused Amtrak's offer to help evacuate victims. FEMA prevented the Coast Guard from delivering diesel fuel. The Red Cross was denied access to the Superdome to deliver emergency supplies. Offers of help from private medical air transport companies were blocked or ignored. Calls from the American Bus Association and the Motor Coach Association went unreturned. FEMA ordered 25,000 mobile homes, costing $900 million. They went virtually unused because FEMA's own regulations prohibited placing mobile homes on floodplains, which is where most Katrina victims lived. FEMA shipped millions of pounds of ice to staging areas far from the Gulf Coast, sending truckers on chaotic cross-country routes with no clear destination. 2 years after the storm, the agency threw out $100 million worth of unused ice. The agency's leadership was shockingly uninformed. Director Michael Brown learned about the convention center crisis from a television reporter, not from his own staff. The disconnect between what was happening on the ground and what officials believed was happening in Washington was so vast that it defied comprehension. Brown was removed from his position on September 9th. He resigned 3 days later, but the damage was already done. The evacuation of New Orleans saved many lives. Roughly 90% of the city's population managed to leave before the storm, but the remaining 10%, approximately 100,000 people, were left behind. Many of them were left behind because the plan to evacuate them never existed in any meaningful way. The city's emergency plan called for using public transit to move residents without cars, but buses were never staged, drivers were never assigned, routes were never planned. The school bus fleet that could have transported thousands sat in parking lots and was flooded. When the Louisiana National Guard requested 700 buses from FEMA, they received 100. The people who did not evacuate were overwhelmingly poor, elderly, disabled, or all three. Many did not have the money for gas, a hotel room, or food on the road. Many did not have family elsewhere to stay with. Many were physically unable to travel without assistance that never came. To blame these people for staying, as some commentators did in the days after the storm, is to blame a wheelchair-bound grandmother for not climbing stairs. The failure was not theirs. The failure belonged to a system that knew they were there and chose not to plan for them. The communication infrastructure in New Orleans collapsed almost immediately. Cell towers were destroyed. Landlines went dead. Police radios failed. Emergency dispatchers lost contact with first responders. FEMA officials in Washington could not reach FEMA officials on the ground. There was no unified command. Local police, state emergency management, the National Guard, FEMA, the Coast Guard, and the military were all operating independently, often without knowledge of what the others were doing. Equipment was not interoperable. Emergency responders, guard units, and active-duty military all used different communication systems that could not talk to each other. The result was chaos. Resources were sent to the wrong places. Survivors were passed over by rescuers who did not know they were there. Help that was available was not dispatched because no one knew it was needed. One investigation after another reached the same conclusion. The failures were not caused by the hurricane. They were caused by humans. They were caused by decisions made. And decisions not made over decades. And for the most part, no one was ever held accountable. The Congressional Select Bipartisan Committee to investigate the preparation for and response to Hurricane Katrina published its findings in a report titled "A Failure of Initiative." The title was precise. At every level of government, local, state, and federal, the initiative to prepare, to act, to protect had been absent. Mayor Negin had delayed the mandatory evacuation order. Governor Blanco had struggled to coordinate between state and federal agencies. President Bush had initially seemed detached from the crisis. FEMA Director Brown had been tragically uninformed. The Army Corps of Engineers had built levees on foundations of clay. Congress had underfunded the protection system for decades, and the people who suffered the consequences of all these failures were the people who had the least power to change any of them. The elderly woman in the lower Ninth Ward who couldn't drive, the single mother in New Orleans East who couldn't afford a hotel room in Baton Rouge, the disabled veteran in St. Bernard Parish who couldn't walk to higher ground. They paid the price for other people's decisions. They always do. The financial cost of Hurricane Katrina is staggering. In 2005, NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information estimated the total damage at $125 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that figure exceeds $186 billion, making Katrina the costliest natural disaster in American history. No hurricane before or since has caused more economic damage. In New Orleans alone, 134,000 housing units, 70% of all occupied units, suffered damage. More than 1 million housing units across the Gulf Coast region were affected. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. In the lower Ninth Ward, Whole blocks were wiped clean, nothing left but concrete slabs and scattered debris where homes had stood for decades. Federal aid was massive but slow and often poorly distributed. Congress approved more than $120 billion in emergency spending. But getting that money to the people who needed it was another matter. FEMA's individual assistance programs were plagued by delays, bureaucratic confusion, and fraud. Insurance claims were contested by companies looking to minimize payouts. Many homeowners discovered they had flood damage that their homeowner's insurance did not cover, and had not purchased separate flood insurance because their neighborhoods had never flooded before. The population collapse was immediate and devastating. Before Katrina, New Orleans had approximately 455,000 residents. By July of 2006, that number had dropped to roughly 209,000, a loss of more than half the city's population. Many evacuees were scattered across the country. Houston alone absorbed more than 250,000 Katrina evacuees. Some found new lives in new cities. Others spent months and years in temporary housing, waiting for a chance to return. The rebuilding was agonizingly slow. In many neighborhoods, it took years before basic services were restored. Schools remained closed. Hospitals were shuttered. Grocery stores did not reopen. The infrastructure that makes a community livable, the small, everyday things that people take for granted, had to be rebuilt from nothing. Some neighborhoods recovered faster than others. The French Quarter and the Garden District, which sit on higher ground and were less damaged, bounced back relatively quickly. The tourist economy returned. Restaurants reopened. Jazz clubs began playing again. But in the lower Ninth Ward, recovery was measured not in months, but in decades. 20 years after the storm, parts of the neighborhood still show empty lots where houses once stood. The population of the lower Ninth Ward has never returned to its pre-Katrina levels. By 2015, 10 years after the storm, the population of New Orleans had recovered to about 386,000, roughly 80% of its pre-Katrina population. By 2024, it had dropped slightly to approximately 363,000. The city has never fully recovered to its pre-storm size, and the demographics have shifted. The city is smaller, wealthier, and whiter than it was before Katrina. Many of the black families who were displaced never returned. Their absence has fundamentally changed the character of neighborhoods that had been African American communities for generations. The physical rebuilding of New Orleans is both a success story and a cautionary tale. New hospitals were built, new schools were constructed. The city's public education system was completely restructured. Some of the new infrastructure is better than what existed before, but the process of rebuilding exposed the same inequalities that the storm had revealed. Wealthier neighborhoods recovered faster. Poorer neighborhoods were left behind. The promise of building back better was kept for some and broken for others. The scars are still visible. Drive through the lower Ninth Ward today, and you will see empty lots next to brand new homes, next to abandoned, flood-damaged structures that have never been torn down. You will see Robert Greene's concrete steps. 2. The only thing left of his mother's house. You will see the pink waterline marks that some homeowners have left on their walls as a reminder. You will see a community that is trying to come back but that will never be what it was. For years after Katrina, tens of thousands of displaced residents lived in FEMA trailers. Small, cramped mobile homes parked on the lots where their houses had stood or in sprawling temporary communities. The trailers were supposed to be temporary. For some families, they became semi-permanent homes for years. Residents later reported health problems linked to formaldehyde exposure from the construction materials used in the trailers, a final insult from an agency that had already failed them. The Road Home Program, Louisiana's primary mechanism for distributing federal rebuilding funds, was plagued by delays and complaints. Applicants waited months or years for decisions. Grants often fell far short of actual rebuilding costs. The program used pre-storm home values to calculate grants, which meant that homeowners in lower-income neighborhoods where home values were depressed by decades of disinvestment, received less money than homeowners in wealthier areas, even if the physical damage to their homes was identical. The insurance battles were equally brutal. Thousands of homeowners found themselves caught between their homeowners insurance, which covered wind damage, and the National Flood Insurance Program, which covered flood damage. Insurance companies argued that the damage was caused by flooding, not wind, and denied claims. Flood insurance carriers argued the opposite. Homeowners caught in the middle hired lawyers, filed appeals, and waited. Some simply gave up. They took whatever settlement was offered, packed what they could carry, and started over somewhere else. The diaspora of Katrina evacuees reshaped cities across the South and beyond. Houston absorbed the largest share. More than 250,000 people in the months after the storm. Atlanta, Baton Rouge, Dallas, Memphis, Birmingham. Cities across the region saw their populations swell with displaced New Orleanians who brought their culture, their resilience, and their grief with them. For those who returned, rebuilding was an act of defiance. It was slow, it was expensive, it was emotionally exhausting. But block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, New Orleans came back. Not the same city, but a city. And for many of its residents, that was enough. Katrina changed America. It changed how we think about disasters. It changed how we respond to them. And it exposed truths about the country that many people had preferred not to see. The most immediate and tangible change was to the levee system itself. After Katrina, Congress authorized the construction of a new flood protection system for New Orleans. The Hurricane and Storm Damage Risk Reduction System, or HSDRRS. The federal government invested $14.4 billion in the project, one of the largest civil engineering undertakings in American history. The Army Corps of Engineers rebuilt and expanded almost 200 miles of levees across 3 parishes. They constructed the Lake Borgne Storm Surge Barrier, a 1.8-mile-long, $1.3 billion structure that is the largest design-build civil works project in the Corps' history. The new system is designed to protect against a 1-in-100-year storm surge of approximately 15 feet, equivalent to a Category 3 hurricane. Notably, the Corps no longer calls it hurricane protection. They call it risk reduction. The language is deliberate. It acknowledges that no levee system can guarantee absolute safety. The system was tested during Hurricane Ida in 2021. It held. No levees were breached. The new system worked as designed. For the people of New Orleans, it was a moment of profound relief and a vindication of the investment. When Ida's winds subsided and the water receded, residents emerged to find damage from wind and rain, but not the catastrophic flooding that had defined Katrina. The levees held. The pump stations functioned. The surge barriers did their job. It was proof that when the government invests adequately in infrastructure, the investment pays for itself in lives saved and property protected. But Ida also revealed the limits of the new system. Communities outside the HSDRRS perimeter, in Lafourche Parish, in Grand Isle, in parts of Plaquemines Parish, were devastated. The system protects metropolitan New Orleans. It does not protect everyone. In 2006, Congress passed the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. The legislation sought to strengthen FEMA's internal infrastructure and address the failures that had been exposed. It clarified the role of the FEMA administrator, mandated better coordination between federal, state, and local agencies, and required improved planning for vulnerable populations, the elderly, the disabled, and those without transportation. Katrina also changed the culture of emergency management. The concept of contraflow evacuation became standard practice along the Gulf Coast. Warning systems were improved. Evacuation plans were expanded to include provisions for residents without cars. The failures of Katrina became case studies taught in every emergency management program in the country. The cultural impact was enormous. Spike Lee's documentary, When the Levees Broke, released in 2006, became one of the most important documentary films about an American disaster. It gave voice to survivors and held the government accountable in ways that journalism alone could not. Dozens of books, films, albums, and works of art emerged from the Katrina experience. The storm became a touchstone in American cultural memory, a before and after line for an entire generation. Memorials dot the landscape of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. In the lower Ninth Ward, a monument marks the spot where the levee was breached. Along the Mississippi coast, markers indicate the height of the storm surge. The names of the dead are inscribed in stone at various sites across the region. At the Hurricane Katrina Memorial in New Orleans, a mausoleum holds the remains of unidentified and unclaimed victims of the storm, a solemn reminder that some of those who died were never identified, never claimed, never given the dignity of being named. Every August 29th, the city pauses. Church bells ring, names are read, second-line parades wind through the streets. The anniversary is not a celebration, it is a reckoning. A day when New Orleans remembers what it lost and honors what it found in the wreckage. Strength, community, the stubborn, irrational, deeply human refusal to abandon a place that the rest of the world had written off. But the most important question remains unanswered. Is New Orleans safe? The HSDRRS is one of the most sophisticated flood protection systems in the world, but it was designed for a 100-year storm. Katrina was estimated to be between a 50-year and a 500-year event, depending on location. Climate change is making hurricanes more intense and sea levels higher. The land beneath New Orleans continues to sink. The coastal wetlands that once served as a natural buffer against storm surge have been eroding for decades. The levees are already showing signs of age. Soil settlement is causing some sections to sink below their design heights. Maintenance funding has been uncertain. And the question that hung over New Orleans before Katrina hangs over it still. Not whether another major storm will come, but when. At the beginning of tonight's story, I asked you if you had ever watched water rise inch by inch and realized there was nothing you could do to stop it. For the people of New Orleans, that was not a hypothetical question. It was Monday morning. It was the sound of their walls cracking. It was the water coming up through the floor. It was the moment they realized that the city they loved, the city that had loved them back, was not going to protect them. What Katrina revealed was not just the weakness of levees, it revealed the weakness of promises. The promise that the government would be there when it mattered. The promise that the infrastructure would hold. The promise that every citizen, regardless of income, regardless of race, regardless of age, would be protected equally. Those promises drowned in the same water that drowned the lower Ninth Ward. But something else was revealed too, something that gives this story its heartbeat. In the midst of the worst failure of government in modern American memory, ordinary people did extraordinary things. A stranger in a canoe saved a pregnant woman and her baby. A former Marine hot-wired boats to rescue 240 of his neighbors. Coast Guard crews flew into the storm and pulled 33,500 people to safety. Volunteers from across the country drove toward the disaster while everyone else was driving away. The people of New Orleans did not choose this story. It chose them. And they responded with a resilience that defied everything the water tried to take. Robert Greene still walks from Tennessee Street to the Old Oak Tree every August 29th. He wears his original Roof Riders shirt. A brass band plays behind him. He reads the names of the dead. And then the music lifts, and the second line begins, and for a few hours, grief shares the street with joy. Because that is what New Orleans does. That is what it has always done. I'm a New Orleanian, Greene says simply, and that says everything. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the people in your own life, about the ground beneath your own feet, about the walls that stand between you and the water, please take a moment to subscribe. We'll be back soon with another story, because these stories deserve to be told, and these people deserve to be remembered. Sleep well tonight, and be grateful for the ground beneath your feet.